You're listening to a podcast of spurious morality.
Hello and welcome to a podcast of Spurious Morality. I'm Johnston and I'm joined again by Connor. Hello, Connor.
Hello!
And we're continuing to look at Big Finish releases while we were away in between series, while we were having a few months off podcasting. And it's been really difficult, I think, to narrow down what to talk about because they've released some really, really good stuff. We've had some really enjoyable stuff. We talked about Beyond Banner and Road last time. We talked about Dark Season last time. But we didn't actually talk about all that much Doctor Who. We talked about the Ninth Doctor stuff. Pioneers was a great set, but we've kind of come back today with a few Doctor Who sets we'd like to talk about. And I think that Big Finish is finally sort of hitting its stride with the box sets, the Doctor box sets now. Now the main range is gone, the monthly range is gone, and we're in box sets. I think last year it kind of got us started, and some hit the ground running a little bit more than others. The Sixth Doctor jumped into new companion, new storyline, whereas the Fifth Doctor was kind of maybe held back a bit by the 40 sets, which they kind of had to do. It was the Fifth Doctor's 40th anniversary, but it kind of got in the way of really getting this box set era started. So one of the sets we are going to talk about today is the Fifth Doctor Adventures Conflicts of Interest. So there will be spoilers for that. We're going to talk about the Sixth Doctor and Purity Unleashed. The Fourth Doctor, Series 12. There's two sets there to discuss. And a very recent one, the Seventh Doctor set, Far From Home, which I like to think is starting a sort of trend of naming Seventh Doctor sets after Spider-Man films.
When are we going to get the amazing Seventh Doctor then?
The Seventh Doctor's amazing in everything, nearly everything. We're going to talk about those, so that's your spoiler warning. And I've really enjoyed all of these sets. It's kind of it is difficult to pick what's been the best Doctor Who from Big Finish so far this year, because there's been a lot of great stuff, not just in these sets. There's been other things as well, Doctors popping up in other things and all sorts of stuff, as there usually is. But I think that this is a good opportunity to have a look at the box sets so far this year, compare them to last year, that kind of thing. So the first one we're going to go for is one that we were particularly excited about because in between series we did release a special episode and we were joined by Jacqueline Rayner, who was absolutely fantastic. She came on and talked to us about the Sixth Doctor Mel and Hebe stuff, the Sixth Doctor Adventures as they stand at the moment. And we released that episode the day before Purity Unleashed came out. And she sort of gave us a few tantalising hints that kind of when we went in and listened to the set, there were that I don't know about you, Connor, but I definitely had a few moments of, oh yeah, she did mention that, didn't she, sort of thing, or hinted at it.
I know there was I know you can't really point at the screen with audio drama, but there were a few moments where if this had been TV Doctor Who, I've been leaning forward in my chair and going, that's the thing.
Yeah, basically recreating the Leonardo DiCaprio meme from Once Upon a
That's
Time in Hollywood. Yeah.
that is the one. That is the very one. Um, yeah, I really really like this set. Um, it feels the Purity arc feels like a wee bit of a throwback to those really early days of Big Finish. That felt really really obvious in this set. Those sort of early, very heavily serialized Evelyn and Hex arcs in particular, and that's helped, by Evelyn getting a couple of name drops. I think she's name dropped in this one. She was certainly in the first one as well. It's just really nice to see Big Finish going back to their history with this sort of thing. And it's a really really strong set of stories as well. It's three of Big Finish's very very strongest writers here. In Matthew Sweet, Chris Chapman, and Ian Potter, all of whom I love their work. I love it so much. Um, Broadway belongs to me. It's a strange choice of opener for the set, I think, but it's a really really good episode. It's a little bit more standalone than you'd expect. But I love that idea of some of the Doctor's, spoilers for the set, some of the Doctor's enemies sort of teaming up to try and discredit him, which is the whole idea here of getting him, the whole thing, this big runaround with this musical and Mel appearing in it is just a big, it's just a roundabout way of getting the Doctor to have his picture taken shaking hands with a Nazi. Um, and it turns out that the people behind it are this sort of ragtag group of his least, I think he says it's his least memorable villains. Like, no one knows who they are. And we get that really, like, it appeals to me very specifically, but it's Martin O'Neill, formerly of the Northern Irish football team. He was their manager, and he makes a little cameo appearance in this at the end. So yeah, it's a great set. I think my highlight would probably be the second one, by Chris Chapman. You get this sort of run, this time hopping adventure, chase through history thing with the Doctor and Mel in pursuit of purity, and Professor McBride, and it's just fantastic. It just zips and sings the whole way through. And I remember sitting in the car listening to this, just the way the characters are interacting, the Doctor arguing with Patricia. The whole arc has just been building up to this sort of thing. And it was absolutely, it feels like it's all starting to pay off. They've done a lot of the groundwork. It's coming to a head now. I'm a really, really big fan of this. It feels like it's exactly what I want from Big Finish. That you're getting, this build up and payoff, and there's a plan behind it. You can really get the sense that this has been planned and thought out, and isn't going to overstay its welcome either. It's not going to take years and years for this storyline to be ended. I think they've already said that the Purity arc is going to finish in the next box set. I think it's called Purity Unbound. It's only just recently been sort of the details revealed for it there. Um, but I'm really really enjoying it.
Yeah, it's really good to see this kind of storyline being done at Big Finish. Apart from the kind of obvious implications of the storyline itself. I guess the ethics of the villain. The villain genuinely, Patricia McBride genuinely doesn't think she's doing anything wrong. She thinks she's making the world better, and the fact that she's being kind of given the power to reshape the world in the way that she sees things. It's an excellent sort of character study, really. Sort of allowing that kind of character to appear. And we never usually get that kind of villain. A lot of time, villains are mustache twirling, or doing it for the money, or doing it for the power, or all that kind of thing. Whereas this is genuinely a villain who thinks they're doing the right thing. And it just happens to be that their view of the world, their morality is pretty horrific, really. But it's good to see a storyline, a story arc being done in this way across multiple sets. The events of one set have a genuine effect on the next. Hebe's missing for pretty much all of this set. She appears in the last few minutes in a not quite restored timeline, setting up for the next set, obviously. I do really, really like how that's been handled, how we've been introduced to this new character, how we've grown to like her over two sets, and then she is ripped away by the villain. And all of a sudden, it feels very, very personal to the Doctor and Mel. And it's quite nice to have that as a motivation. The Doctor's not just trying to stop evil. The Doctor is trying to get his friend back, and that again is something that we don't see very often. Go ahead.
What I think with Patricia as well, I might have mentioned this before on this show, but there was one of the previous box sets. It must have been the second in the series, which would have been Patricia's. It was Chronomancer, where Patricia's mask sort of comes off, and we get to see what she's really like, and there's little hints being dropped, and the Doctor says he's noticed them, across the way about her, being, about her basically being, a eugenicist or a want to be eugenicist. There's a bit where she lists off about the things she considers to be unnatural and should be removed. It's the likes of homosexuality, neurodiversity. There's a couple of others in there as well. Maybe it's because I around about the time that came out, I had sort of tried to reconnect with a couple of old friends from school and looked them up on Facebook. One of them, when I went onto his Facebook timeline, there was this very long list of posts that Patricia could have written. And this was literally in the same week, the set had just come out. And I was reading this stuff, and I just thought, it might seem, like someone, like, in this day and age, like someone like Patricia couldn't really exist, that someone would never go that far. There are people, still out there who do believe the things that Patricia believes in these stories. And I have no doubt that if they were given the resources she's been given in these stories, would have no hesitation in doing the exact same thing. She does feel like a very, very believable and very, very, I suppose, close to home sort of villain, is what I'm trying to say there.
Yeah, it's, you do see that kind of, bile, I suppose is the right word, thrown across the internet pretty much on a daily basis. It's so easy to find something so intensely unpleasant. And I guess that this purity arc is kind of exploring what the conclusion, the inevitable conclusion of that is, posting something hateful on the internet is one thing, but what if you actually had the power to reshape the world to fit that view? And it's actually terrifying when you think about how many people you do see posting hateful kind of stuff, and how far would they take that, I guess. And I think the fact that these sets have got us having this conversation, a proof of just how sort of good it is, how powerful it is, how well written it is. And yeah, it's good to see something so thought-provoking coming from Big Finish.
Absolutely. It has been a real joy to go through this series. And I hope whatever arc comes next, because I think when we had Jacqueline Rayner on, she said that there's going to be other arcs in a similar sort of style. I cannot wait for the next one, and I'm paying a lot more attention to the Sixth Doctor adventures than I used to, for sure.
I think this is the most essential Sixth Doctor listening there's been since Evelyn, really. I think it's fair to say.
Yes, I would agree. I do really, really enjoy. It's a change of style. I do really enjoy a lot of the Sixth Doctor Constance and Flip stories, but I enjoy them more as standalone adventures that you can drop into, rather than as an ongoing series. It's the continuity and the serialization that these have that appeals to me the most. I think that it makes it worth your while listening to them and investing in them. Rather than having, a lot of the times, and they're perfectly good stories, but a lot of Big Finish you can drop into, do one or two stories in the box, in whatever box set you've bought, and there's no continuing, story arc. There's no, that's a fine format, but it's this sort of thing that gives me the most satisfaction, I think, where you're invested, you've followed a story, and it's building up over a long period of time. It's the most rewarding sort of experience I think I have with Big Finish.
Yeah, I'd agree, absolutely. And I suppose, really, I just want to finish by saying that we've talked about how thought provoking and how dark these sets are. They are intensely enjoyable as well. Um, there's an awful lot to enjoy. They are genuine, rip roaring, proper Doctor Who adventures. It's not like the usual enjoyment you get from Doctor Who has been sacrificed for this story arc. It is still there. It's still present. Uh, Broadway belongs to. Was it Broadway belongs to Mel or me?
I think it was Broadway belongs to me, but I think they've maybe missed a trick when not calling it Broadway
Yeah.
belongs to
For
Mel.
some reason, I had it in my head that it was called Broadway Belongs to Mel, which is a great idea. Broadway Belongs to Me. Um, it's it's hilarious, and I have to admit, I kind of got to it, and sort of within perhaps the first 10 minutes, sort of found that I wasn't enjoying it as much as I could be, and I thought, oh no, maybe Matthew Sweet's finally got a little bit too indulgent. Like, Matthew Sweet should always be indulgent when writing. I don't think anyone would argue with that because the result is always magnificent. But I just thought, oh no, maybe this is a bit too much. But then as the story unfolded and I kind of got an idea of what it was doing and where it was going, I just fell in love with it. And any doubts I had were kind of gone by the halfway mark. And by the end, I think it was perhaps one of the funniest Big Finish releases there's ever been. The whole concept of the Doctor's Z-list enemies teaming up to destroy his reputation, and him not remembering who any of them are. It was just brilliant. It was an excellent bit of comedy writing, um, and yeah, I really really enjoyed it. So there is still a lot of fun to be had in these sets, even though they are dealing with such a heavy subject matter.
Just as an aside before we move on, I have never yet seen any of his interviews on the collection sets. I'm planning a massive run through of those nearer to the anniversary, the 60th anniversary in November. I can't wait to get into them, but I feel I need to do a little bit of a Matthew Sweet marathon of his Big Finish stories as well.
I mean, it's a damn good marathon to do. There is some great stuff in there. Some great Jago and Lightfoot. Year of the Pig's a lot of fun. But yeah, we'll move on, and we will move on to the so far this year's only, but this year's first Fifth Doctor set, which was Conflicts of Interest, and I want to talk about one story in particular from this one actually, which I found to be really really enjoyable, and that was Friendly Fire by John Dorney. Somebody else we've had on this podcast, of course. I feel as though we need to keep name dropping every time. Yes, so it was John Dorney's story, and I've said this many times before. When I see John Dorney's name on a sort of announcement, I kind of think, yep, I'm looking forward to that one. That's going to be a good story. It's going to be something I enjoy. I really do enjoy what John Dorney writes. And I think John Dorney on a bad day is still absolutely excellent. But this was not John Dorney on a bad day. This was John Dorney on a very good day. So this is when the new box set era started to experiment with three-parters. And I think this story works very well as a three-parter. I think that it does have that kind of very clear beginning, middle, and end. It doesn't outstay its welcome. It could have been a four-parter. It could have been padded out a bit, and we could have got that extra bit. But actually, I think it benefits from just being that sort of half an hour shorter um, than it would have been if it was a monthly range adventure a couple of years ago. What did you think of Friendly Fire, Connor?
I really, really liked it. I'm the same as yourself. I'm a really big fan of the 3-part format for these. Um, and it's something we can talk about with the new Seventh Doctor adventures as well, because they go down the same route. I remember watching Survival for the first time and being a little bit disappointed that it ended. Doctor Who ended on a 3-parter. It felt wrong. Going into it, but I actually really, really like it. It doesn't ever, it doesn't outstay its welcome at any stage. It gives you that sort of neat 3 act structure, which is probably quite traditional, but it's traditional for a reason because it works. Um, and it makes the story feel a little bit neater, more compact. There's no time being wasted here at any stage because there's no time to waste. Um, it just moves along at a nice pace, and you get this nice, perfectly rounded story in 3 parts. So I'm a really, really big fan of that format. And I'm a big fan of this story as well. I really, really enjoy that it's not some universe-ending threat. It's not, the stakes are no bigger than the Doctor and his companions need to stay alive. They get dropped into this dangerous environment with some very dangerous people, and it's not that there's an enemy to fight. There's no cause, behind them here. They're just fighting for their own survival. They're just trying to get through this with their skin intact. So I really like that sort of story. It's a great sort of pulpy feel, for the 1980s team, for the Fifth Doctor, Nyssa and Tegan. Um, I really like that sort of tone and feel to a story. And it's very, very well put together, very, very well acted. Um, Also really, really loved the music in this one. Very reminiscent of the Fifth Doctor's era, that sort of 80s synth sound, but it feels modern and up to date as well. It works really, really well. I definitely will go back and revisit that music suite at some stage.
See, I've heard a few people say that the music was a bit overpowering, and while it was definitely prominent, but I think it fit in with the story quite well and kind of really contributed to the atmosphere and the world building that was going on. Like it's the whole sort of, it was kind of like a western in space, sci-fi western setting. It said it kind of reminded me of very slightly of the Borderlands games, the sort of advanced society, but it's also a bit western and sort of barely clinging to existence. It's falling apart, that kind of thing. Obviously, didn't have the humor of Borderlands, but very sort of that sense of social decay, sci-fi social decay, I guess, was there, and I quite like that.
Yes, that's sort of. I said this to you just before we started recording there, but it reminded me very much of that little town, Cobb Vanth leads in The Mandalorian.
Yes,
Um, it's that sort of lived in sci-fi, very, very beaten up, um, dust and wind swept world, that sci-fi does incredibly well. And it's an aesthetic that I always love and find very easy to visualize. Just makes things feel a little bit more on the edge. That sort of pioneer, remote, uh, no real society or support net to fall back on. Um, it's very, very effective. I do understand what people say about the music feeling overpowering. I don't think it did so much in this story. I definitely noticed it more in The Edge of the War, which is the second story in the set, where a lot of the dialogue seemed quite lower volume and the music was quite high. So I did struggle a little bit at times just to decipher what was going on because the voices were so quiet at times and the music was quite loud. But that was more of a thing with The Edge of the War than Friendly Fire.
Yeah, it's a funny one whenever it gets mentioned. I think because I think some of the music is. It's not that it's loud and overpowering. It's just that it's memorable. It stands out, which has its advantages and disadvantages, I guess. But I certainly didn't have a problem with it in Friendly Fire and thought it really enhanced the story. Okay, we shall move on. And we shall move to the Fourth Doctor, who's had a couple of sets out in the last few months. So, the Fourth Doctor Adventures Series 12, which finally we've had Margaret as a full time companion. She joined in Ice Heist and stayed all the way through to the Ghost of Margaret, and it's kind of nice to have that. It's another series, it's another era within an era, and I do like it when the Fourth Doctor Adventures does this. It's great to have an extra season with Leela and that kind of thing, or but it's when they kind of build something else in there. So we've got the Ankelso season, we've got this with Margaret, and I'd even argue perhaps the sort of further East Base adventures in season 9 or series 9. Um, it's when the Fourth Doctor adventures really shine. Is when they're really adding to sort of the Fourth Doctor's life, I guess, adding another little era into it. To talk to us a bit about the Fourth Doctor Adventures Series 12, what were your highlights?
I'm a really, really big fan of this series. I have sung its praises, all that week it came out. Um, so the first set was New Frontiers, which I enjoyed. I think Ice Heist in particular was my favourite out of those two stories. But it's Angels and Demons. It's the second box set here, which has the bulk of the stories in it. There's 4 stories in this set, which is very unusual these days for Big Finish. In fact, with every other range, I think it's probably borderline impossible. But so that makes this feel like a really, really chunky set. You're getting a lot of bang for your buck here. But the stories are, all of them, absolutely fantastic. The Wizard of Time, kicking things off, is not at all your standard Fourth Doctor adventure. It feels very, very new, very, very experimental. Is maybe not the word, but it feels a little bit more out there than the Fourth Doctor's usual sort of story. A little bit fairy tale, and a lot of it's sort of based around what I felt was our, we as the listeners, it sort of plays on our nostalgia for stories. It's the little series of novels, and the one of the characters has written in is called Dark Forever. It's very clearly meant to be a stand-in for the Target novels, and that there's an image on the cover which is very reminiscent of some of the Target novels. But it sort of plays into the listener's nostalgia for watching or reading or listening to Doctor Who when we were younger or over years gone by, and sort of uses that as an element within the story. So that I really enjoyed. The highlight, though, is it's difficult to pick between Stone Cold and the Ghost of Margaret. Stone Cold's fantastic because you're getting this new series monster in a Fourth Doctor style story. In a way that feels entirely natural. There's a version of this where Stone Cold doesn't have the Weeping Angels on the cover, and we, as listeners, go into it not knowing the Weeping Angels are in it because it builds up to that reveal very, very well, and very, very effectively. But it's that last episode just feels really, really tense and dangerous. And it does the right thing by putting Margaret in danger in a story just before, we as listeners know that there's a story just after this called The Ghost of Margaret. So you do feel like something can happen to her. Nothing's going to happen to the Doctor, nothing's going to happen to Leela because they're established characters. We know what happens to them in the TV series. But Margaret, gives you Margaret and by extension, original characters and original companions give us the opportunity as listeners to end up on the edge of our seats because we don't have any foreknowledge of what's going to happen to them. There's stakes involved there, and that's what Stone Cold did so well.
Yeah, I think it really did a good job of playing into that. Like I was saying, when we do get these new characters, there is kind of another element added, and I think you're right. It's that level of danger. It's in a normal Fourth Doctor and Leela story, as you say, we know they're safe. But Margaret being there in that situation, and it's a pretty horrible story for Margaret. She goes through an awful lot. It's an unpleasant experience for her. And I think that's just handled so well, and I like the fact that it's enough for Margaret. That's the point where she goes, actually, I don't like this anymore. I want to go home, because the Weeping Angels are particularly unpleasant creatures. So yeah, it really was a good story. It's hard to pick a favourite. It's very hard to pick a favourite from that second set. I did find that the Wizard of Time, it reminded me of a companion chronicle almost, or maybe a short trip. It was kind of a super long short trip that was full cast and everything else. But it was very enjoyable. The Friendly Invasion, great story, really strong stuff from Chris Chapman, who we've had on this podcast.
Who have we not mentioned? Who have we had on that we haven't mentioned so far? Rob Valentine. He was on this podcast,
and Joe Lister as well, Joseph Lidster.
Oh yes, of course.
Yeah. And you've been on this podcast.
Have I? Never.
Yes. I've been on this podcast. Yeah, but yeah,
it's the second series, and we've gone all self-indulgent. This was always going to happen.
I like the idea of when we get to series 10, like I can just come on as a special guest. I don't know who'd be running it. I don't know who'd be, doing all the editing and stuff. But yeah, I can come back on as a special guest, and it can be a really big thing. Like they can actually call the episode bigger than Lidster.
This is where. I was just going to say, this is the point in the episode where you see the engagement just drop off.
Yeah. Anyway, let's try not to lose all of our listeners. So yeah, The Friendly Invasion was a great story. It was kind of it's a bit of World War II that's not really looked at a lot at all, which is obviously American troops being in the UK. And this is the second story Chris Chapman has written that is set in a bit of World War II that you don't normally look at. Because he did the... Oh, come on, Johnstone, what's it called?
Scorched Earth.
Scorched Earth, thank you. I was like, burning something, fiery, burning... No. But he also did Scorched Earth, which was kind of set, just after the liberation of France. And it dealt with stuff that a lot of historical dramas, films, etc., don't look at. And I really like that. It's a very, very sort of interesting thing to dig into. Such a significant, huge part of history, but kind of the lesser talked about bits of it. And I do think it was sort of a really effective atmospheric story. It was 2 parts. It kind of got going really, really quickly. There was a nice little bit of setup, and then the Doctor and Leela arrive, and it gets weird. And yeah, I really liked how that sort of went, how that was formatted. Stone Cold, there've been a million brilliant things said about it, as there should be. It's excellent. It sort of surprises me, really, how well the Weeping Angels work on audio, because theoretically they're a very, very visual villain. They don't talk. There's no angel dialogue, really. Okay, they occasionally nick somebody's vocal cords or whatever it is that happened in Flesh and Stone, but really it's such an interesting idea, and it's so brilliantly weird how well it does translate to audio. So I do like Big Finish's Weeping Angels adventures. They do work really well. And they're just a fantastic villain to start with. They're easily the greatest Doctor Who creation since 2005. I don't think there are many people that'd argue with that. If somebody wants to tweet me and explain to me why it's the Absorbal off, then feel free. But meanwhile, I'm going to assume that it's the Angels that win. And then we have The Ghost of Margaret, which is really an absolutely beautiful sort of departure story for a character who we really have come to love over the course of was it 7 stories that she's in total? I liked the teaser that we got in Ravencliff Witch, like when the Doctor first meets her, and I like the idea of the Doctor going back and picking her up later on when he's with Leela, and the Margaret Leela sort of friendship is something beautiful as well. It's an excellent dynamic, and yeah, I like the fact that Margaret gets a proper exit, and I also like the fact that the Doctor and Leela stay with her for a bit. They're kind of forced to; they've no choice. But it's nice to see that she's one of the very, very few people the Doctor will stick around for. And it's brilliantly done. And I think in some ways there was kind of a hint of we keep harking back to Evelyn in this episode, but there's kind of a hint of thicker than water, how the Sixth Doctor refused to say goodbye to Evelyn properly, and then sort of revisits her later and kind of deal with that. The Ghost of Margaret does something similar at the start of the story. The Doctor goes and doesn't say goodbye properly, and he kind of has to face the consequences of that. And it's beautifully done. It's a great little story. I think if I had to pick a favourite, I would have to go with Stone Cold, though. I think that just the Fourth Doctor and Weeping Angels and a TARDIS team at the absolute height of the powers, a really good TARDIS team at the height of the powers.
Yeah, I would be very, very hard pressed to pick a favourite between Stone Cold and the Ghost of Margaret. Ghost of Margaret, the Doctor lets Margaret down really, really badly here. She wants to get home. This is familiar ground, about the Doctor failing to get his companions back to where they need to be. But it's sort of what happens with Sarah Jane, but with menaces here. It's Margaret left somewhere that's not quite her home, where she's in really serious danger, and where the Doctor and Leela have a really hard time getting back to her. And it involves them sacrificing the TARDIS. And the scene where the Doctor communicates with the TARDIS to ask her permission to do it is absolutely superb. This is maybe one of Tom Baker's best performances as the Doctor, full stop, never mind just at Big Finish. He plays the Doctor's horror, and he's absolutely mortified that this has happened. And he's really, really desperate to get back to Margaret, to the extent that he sacrifices the TARDIS for at least a time. So that gets a massive thumbs up from me. But then on the flip side of all that, the first episode is as I say, that gut-wrenching horror. The second episode has this really, really tender story between Margaret and Ray, which is entirely believable, and every single actor in this story sells it. It's superbly done, superbly written, superbly acted. I adored this. It was an absolute joy to listen to. And again, as you've said, it gives us that closure. It gives us a companion exit story, which between this and between the Purity arc wrapping up, I am very, very happy with, because over the last couple of years, we've had a couple of Big Finish story arcs and companion stories that are still open-ended. We still don't know what's happening with Constance and Flip. Now, I know that's out of Big Finish's hands. But we still don't know what's happening with Ace and Mel. I worry that Liv and Helen are maybe going to go in the same direction, because we're not getting new stories with them this year, which is the first time that's happened in a long time. I'm pleased they're going to do something a little bit different with the Eighth Doctor. But Liv and Helen are probably my two most favorite companions of all time. and I don't really want that story arc left on a thread. I would like some closure there as well. But that's a tangent. What I'm saying is the Ghost of Margaret, you know, putting Margaret, giving her an ending, which I think is probably only a temporary ending. I think she is coming back at some stage. There's going to be a fourth Doctor and Margaret series without Leela, I think, at some stage. I might be misremembering that, but I hope not, because I'm really looking forward to it.
Well,
Um,
I don't recall reading that, but I sincerely hope it's true.
I think it was. I think it was when they announced. They said there was going to be a series of Margaret and Leela, and then there would be a later series with Margaret on her own with the
Oh,
Doctor.
oh, I thought it was just Margaret popping up in Ravencliff Witch and then meeting them again later with Leela. I thought that's what it was.
I might be wrong. I'll have to look this up. But I had always thought there was going to be a Margaret
I
series.
I suspect you are, but I hope you're not. I'd be all over a full Margaret
Oh
series, but
no! I'll have to look that up. I'll look that up and get back to you, listeners, before the end of the
I've
episode.
I have a horrible feeling that the
That this is
Ravencliff
it.
Witch is the solo Margaret.
You know what it is. Do you know what? If this is the end, it's a brilliant ending.
Yeah,
And I like that we don't. I say we get closure on Margaret. We don't know what happens between her and Ray in the end. It's left up to us in our imaginations. Brilliant, perfect ending. We don't need that information. It can be absolutely left in our heads for us to imagine and enjoy our own version of. That's fun. That's top marks. Fantastic, brilliant ending. Brilliant series. Strong, no doubt in my head. Strongest run of 4 DAs of Fourth Doctor adventures rather. Um, I will definitely revisit this many, many times in the years to come.
oh, absolutely. Likewise. I do have to say though, like when you mentioned last week that this may be your favourite Fourth Doctor series, I still prefer Series 9. I still prefer that E-Space run with Romana Radrick and K9. Um, but it's it's in excellent company. It's a very, very, very high bar, and I think this probably is the closest the Fourth Doctor Adventures have come to hitting it outside of that series. We'll move on. We'll move on to the last set we're going to talk about today, and this is a late edition. This is actually it's come out within I think the last week of us recording this. So by the time you hear it, it'll be just under 2 weeks. But it is the Seventh Doctor Adventures. No Way Home. Oh no, that's not the one. Far From Home. Yeah, the Seventh Doctor Adventures Homecoming. Um,
that's
so
that's gonna be Naomi and Harry's last set, isn't it? They're gonna call it Homecoming.
they really should. So I know that a few people are kind of looking at this set and going, well, why is Harry Sullivan travelling with the Seventh Doctor? We don't need that. He's a... I don't care. We're getting more Harry Sullivan. Harry Sullivan is one of the best characters in Doctor Who ever, and they've recast him absolutely brilliantly. It's one of Big Finish's most successful recasts, and it's giving such a wonderful character a second lease of life. Christopher Naylor is a great Harry, and I'm all for this kind of being. It's kind of the third act in this post Android invasion Harry story. We've not had the first act yet. That's the next series of Fourth Doctor Adventures. The second act is the Unit Nemesis sets, which the conclusion of is coming up within the next week or two, I think. So this is kind of the end of the story, and we're kind of getting the end of the story almost first. But I think it works. I think it's great that the Seventh Doctor has reconnected with Harry and, well, Naomi as well. We're going to obviously hear Naomi and the Fourth Doctor in the future. And I enjoyed last year's set. I enjoyed Sullivan and Cross AWOL. I thought that it set up the dynamic quite nicely. I really enjoyed London Orbital as a story. And I think there's a lot of potential to this TARDIS team, and I think that we've kind of seen it properly in this set, I think that we've kind of unlocked that potential in this set. So the last year's set, was all about introducing this TARDIS team and establishing them and moving the characters to where they needed to be. This one feels a lot more like business as usual for this dynamic. So the first story, Operation Dusk, I was instantly blown away by it. I listened to it and just thought, oh, this is really what I want from Doctor Who. It's a proper sort of World War II conspiracy thriller. I sort of posted on Twitter that it's kind of a combination of all the best bits of The Empty Child and Countermeasures. And it's actually inspired me to go and listen to Countermeasures again. It just sort of has that sort of espionage, London espionage feel to it that made me want to go back to Countermeasures. So that's what I'm listening to at the moment. I'm listening to the original 4 Countermeasures sets, and it's come from listening to this story. It's a Vashta Nerada story, but it's full of really kind of vivid imagery, easy to conjure up in the mind. A luminescent alien species and kind of a weaponized version of Vashta Nerada, which has been sort of looked at before. Classic Doctor's New Monsters kind of explored that. But I think that here, the Seventh Doctor in a dark, noir-y World War II thriller with Vashta Nerada, it's fantastic. It's a great setup. And Harry gets to be a spy, and it just feels really good. It feels like everything's just in the right place for this story. What did you think?
I really, really love this set. Both stories. To backtrack slightly, yes, I enjoyed that first set as well. London Orbital was copying. I think I said at the time, London Orbital, is copying massively from Neverwhere. Neverwhere is one of my favorite stories ever. So that's a big plus. I think these stories have a lot more respect for Harry than his, original TV run did. He's not quite the bumbling oaf he used to be. So that gets a big plus from me as well. But these 2 stories in particular, just to home in on Operation Darkness, first of all, feels a lot like Subterfuge, which was the previous couple of years ago 7th Doctor story with the meddling monk, which I've always enjoyed, but I've always enjoyed it sort of in spite of what it's not a perfect story. I think there are flaws there, but I still really, really enjoy it. I love the monk. This feels a lot like Subterfuge, but it's hitting the right notes a lot more often. It has that fantastic espionage spy thriller feel you mentioned, that noirish take on the Vashta Nerada, which works really, really well. They are terrifying as that slightly more cerebral villain as they are here. Like them talking through the radio to their victims is brilliant. But this story also does something else, and I am going to go into full spoiler territory here. And anyone who has not heard the new 7th Doctor set, go and listen to it now, and then come back and resume this podcast. Is we get this bait and switch sort of thing where the Vashta Nerada are mentioned. They were put in the press release as this story was pitched as the 7th Doctor meets the Vashta Nerada. But then in the 3rd episode, we get this reveal that the actual villains here is not the Vashta Nerada, it's the Forge from the 7th Doctor Ace and Hex run. I gasped. It's not very often now. A lot of Big Finish releases these days put their villains on the cover. It's in the press release. It's pitched to you ahead of time. You don't very often get a surprise reveal anymore like this. I properly gasped. It is one of the most exciting things to happen in Big Finish this year. Possibly, in my personal experience of listening to Big Finish, one of the most exciting things, full stop. I was absolutely delighted to hear them back. and as I said earlier on, I'm a really, really big fan of Big Finish reaching back into their own earlier history and bringing back their own original creations, their own original companions and monsters, and villains. So massive, massive plus for that. It made my day to hear the Forge back. They're amazing villains. I will always be up for more of them. And Naomi's arc as well, I really, really liked. It's definitely the B side to Operation Darkness's A side. But that diminishes that diminishes it more than it deserves. It's a really very neatly done story. Um, I really really loved the Doctor's interaction with. I've forgotten the names. There was the Immaturi, which was the younger ones. I've unfortunately forgotten the name of the older side of that species, but it's the Doctor's relationship with their sort of Grand Marshal character, their sort of elder or leader. Um, they sort of have this mind meld contact where the Doctor almost tries to hypnotize her to get her to go back for the TARDIS, which has been lost. And he and Harry have been rescued and brought aboard their ship. Um, the way those two characters, the way the Doctor and this leader elder character interact is very, very engaging listening. The way the two of them work together to bring the TARDIS back from its sort of semi destruction is gorgeously done. Um, and I really really liked. I just really liked the whole story. It's a great idea. It plays out very well. It's maybe a little bit convenient that Naomi is shot off in a random direction and the Doctor and Harry are shot off in another, and they happen to meet this the two halves of this species that are trying to reunite themselves. But I don't care. It's a great story. And it's a lot of fun to listen to. I'll definitely come back to this one soon.
Yeah, I think this run is really building up to be something special. I think, as long as we get a few more sets that are, on par with this, I think it's going to probably be remembered as a pretty decent run. Um, just going back to, you were talking about the Forge reveal. I actually said brilliant out loud while listening to it. And thankfully, I wasn't on public transport at the time. I was in my kitchen cooking. But I kind of feel as though if I was sat on a tram, my reaction would have been exactly the same. And I'd have had a lot of people looking at me quite oddly because I'd just gone, oh, brilliant, at the Seventh Doctor saying the Forge. Um, yeah, it was just, it was the perfect way to round off a brilliant story. As I said previously, I think it took quite a lot from The Empty Child, but if you're going to take a lot from a Doctor Who story, that must surely be one of the first ones you should pick. It's not just it's set in World War II thing. As you say, there were villains talking through the radio and all this kind of thing. It really did borrow from that story, but it borrowed in an incredibly good way and sort of forged its own tale. It wasn't just a remake, as it were.
I genuinely can't get over the Forge. I know I've waxed lyrical about the Forge being back and how brilliant that is. I've done that a lot already here, but it still feels surreal to hear them again or to hear, this version of them again. And in retrospect, it feels totally obvious. It sort of harks back to their involvement in the wars, which was a thing with No Man's Land in the original Hex run. Um, but because their story was done, we'd heard the Forge at sort of every point in their history. I didn't expect to ever hear from them again. It's an absolute delight to do so. You know,
I,
that's just
I
brilliant.
I think we need a Forge Spodcast episode in the not too distant future.
Yeah, I think so. I think
Um,
so.
and that gives me the excuse to listen to a lot of very excellent stories on the way because
Yeah.
genuinely, I can't think of a bad Forge story. I've enjoyed everything that they've even been mentioned in, and I definitely think we should get more of that. And I have to admit, I quite like the idea of us sort of finding out what the Forge were up to when the Third Doctor was on Earth in the 70s, or was it 80s? Unit dating joke, haha. Yeah,
They never
I
get old, do they?
no, absolutely not. Yeah, I'd quite like to find out sort of what the Forge were doing. I guess I'd also quite like to find out what Torchwood were doing then. And we sort of got a hint of that earlier in the year with Double. I guess we got 70s Torchwood, but it kind of didn't relate to what was going on in any way. It was just after Spearhead from space. That's kind of all we can take from it.
They get mentioned in a book as well. Actually, they are in. It's one of the 12th Doctor novels. Cavan Scott, The Shining Men or The Shining Man. I can't remember what the exact title was, but it was one of the Series 10 ones. He meets a character who lives in a bus, and the Doctor mentions Iris Wildtime, and then in the same breath, they talk about Torchwood and the Forge, which I think I read before I seriously got into Big Finish. I must have listened to some Big Finish by that stage, but I had never got anywhere near the Forge. So that was my first memory of hearing about them, and it's been very, very cool because I only listened to that Hex run really over the last year or so. Certainly the later parts of it with the Forge are a bit more prominent. It's very, very cool to catch up on all this. You know, these stories that came out before I was a Big Finish fan. And it's very, very cool to get stories with them popping up now where I do know who they are and I can get this excited about them.
I have to confess that on my bookshelf, unread, sits Project Valhalla, which is the Forge book. That I think it's a Big Finish book. I think actually,
It is. I think it's on their
yeah.
website, or it was at one stage.
I think I nabbed it in one of their last few copies available sales on a sort of I'll read it at some point basis, and then I've meant to re-listen to all the Forge stuff, and I haven't done. So yeah, I definitely think give it a few months' time, and we'll have a Forge Spodcast episode good to go. But I've got to get through other stuff first, like Countermeasures, because we are doing an episode on that in the not too distant future. All right, well that was another set of Big Finish releases from while we were away, while we were offline and not podcasting for a few months. I don't feel like we've caught up at all, really, but we have at least talked about some of our favourite things Big Finish have put out over the last few months. Next week, we're going to be back with, we're going to continue season by season. We're going to have a look at season 8 of Classic Doctor Who. So the Master finally arrives in season by season. And then we're going to be back in a few weeks to discuss other audio-y, Doctor Who-y things, aren't we, Connor?
Indeed. I'm very much looking forward to it.
Yeah, we've got plenty coming up. So yeah, it's been good having a bit of a Big Finish early 2023 catch up with you. So thank you for joining me, Connor.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
And we shall be back very, very soon for more spodcasting. Goodbye now.